Welcome to Season 2 of Funding Rural. We're back and ready to keep exploring how philanthropy can better serve rural and Indigenous communities. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Erin Borla, Executive Director and Trustee of the Sisters Oregon-based Roundhouse Foundation. Today, I want to take the opportunity to expand our view of what we think rural America looks like. When we close our eyes and envision rural, oftentimes we think of an idyllic setting with a cute downtown, cue the Hallmark movies, or an open field with a tractor. With that, there can be this misconception that rural America looks a certain way, namely that it's predominantly white. That's certainly not the case in many rural communities. I invited Jaime Arredondo to talk with me about the work his organization, CAPACES, is doing to reconnect LatinX folks in Oregon with their traditional foods and culture while building community and supporting them with training and other services. Jaime told me that CAPACES grew out of the farm worker movement, the braceros, which goes back to the first half of the 20th century.
There's a large concentration of Latino farm worker indigenous families. And that has a unique story. It dates back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s of the last century when we had a large wave of migrants come up as a result of the bracero program, strong arm man program. That's probably not a good translation for it. But anyhow, it was a collaboration between the Mexican government and the U.S. government to replace the shortage of labor as a result of World War II. And so millions of workers were able to come up north to work in agriculture and fill the need of food shortage in this country. A group started to form called the Oregon's Farm Worker Movement in the late 70s. And CAPACES comes from that movement. We're kind of the baby of it, I would say. We're only, we're going to be 14 next week. So we're kind of that crazy child, right? That was birthed from people that were trying to survive, have been able to integrate into these communities. And so kind of our work if I talk about our work, is that kind of crazy child that has a lot of dreams and aspirations and no limitations, even though there are limitations.
Well, what led you to that role? What led you to the work?
Well, my father was one of those people that came after the braceros, because they would gather back in the village in Michoacan, and they would talk about this place, right? And my dad was one of those kids that was listening. He was just a kid, and so at the age of 15, he came up here, and he's like, somehow, some way, I want my family to come here, even though he had no plan, and no money, and we landed here in 1990. It's just been a beautiful experience. Obviously, it started very, very hard, as a newcomer trying to learn a new language. And the farm worker movement has been my second village, I would say, for me. So I've been involved in this work since I was a kid, community organizing, sort of volunteering and building community in different ways, whether that's civically or providing services and now doing things like farming. So I'm part of that story, part of that journey.
Yeah. Remind me, you said earlier, what age did you immigrate?
I was 8 years old.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. My grandmother immigrated at 13 and had to learn a new language and started in the first grade at 13. And that was so hard. And that was in the 30s. And I can't imagine how challenging that would be in the 80s and 90s. But I'm sure there's all sorts of things that you were able to do and persevere through that. So now you're at CAPACES, and what are some of the key programs that you're doing there, and how are you really supporting that group as the baby of that big program that started and the community organizing?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, the first organization that was formed in 1977 was based in the location where CAPACES is at, and they used to provide immigration services. It was called the Guava Valley Immigration Project. And my father happened to be one of those folks that stepped into that space in the late 80s, right? And that space looks different now. It's a beautiful building with beautiful murals around it. And it's become kind of a hub and a lab for innovation and experimentation. We have grown significantly over time, probably a few $1 million now, 30 plus employees. And some of our newest programming includes the Anahuat Farm, which is an organic farm based in Little Turner, Oregon, just off I-5, 60 acres, and trying to restore a way of life for Indigenous folks from the South here in this state and in this region. So that's our largest program. We also just launched early childhood education and care workforce development program called First Steps, Primeros Pasos. That's aiming to increase the workforce of educators and providers, because there's a massive need in terms
Yeah.
of childcare. A lot of childcare deserts, especially in rural Oregon, right?
Hmm.
And we're trying to help meet that need. So those are some of our programs. We have a civic leadership program as well. We have a youth leadership program. We have a community health worker program that trains and certifies community health workers, and a host of ideas. In fact, we just got a food truck donated by your sister foundation, by the way, Mary Lanfram Foundation.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh my
They're like,
goodness. Yeah.
you're gonna put it to use. So like, think about what you want to do. I'm like, yeah, we'll think of something for sure. It'll be up and running.
Oh my gosh. Well, and I think you and I met around the Anahuac farm and that work. And I think so we started talking about that project, and I said, well, tell me more about what you do. And it was the same. Like, here's all these other litany of things, all the things. It's like whatever the community needs, you show up and do. And I think that's just so exciting. And the other piece that I always thought was awesome was it's called the Three Sisters, right? Corns, bean, and squash.
Or gift to humanity, the milpa. Uh,
Yeah.
it is the staples of the Mexican diet. Is
Yeah.
those three things that is used for, I mean, thousands of dishes.
Hmm.
And obviously, corn has its own purpose as well, right? It's a product that's used for many, many, many things. But the Anahuac people, which is what we call the continent of America, is the place where these staples were created and invented. And
Yeah.
now that we see across the entire world, right? And so, unfortunately, what's happened over time is that a lot of this has been genetically modified,
Mhm.
which has a purpose, but it also has been very hurtful to a lot of communities. We're trying to bring back those indigenous seeds so that we can grow organically, produce milpa, and put it out to community, right? So they can
Mhm.
restore that relationship with what they created and gifted to the world.
Yeah, well, and I think what's so interesting is it stems from one idea, right? Of we're going to have this farm so we can really grow plants and get back to where we want to be. And then it stems to you have folks that are harvesting those foods, and those foods are then you're distributing those, and then you're doing classes. And so it all starts from this one idea, and then it branches out to so many other things. So it's just been really fun to watch how you've grown that program.
Yes, thank you. So we have also, as you might remember, a culinary arts
Hmm.
program that we're also putting out to community, right, from farm to table. And we also have an indigenous languages program that's part of it as well. And obviously, we have the ceremonies. For us, agriculture is important, but ceremonies come with that. We have to be able to ask for permission before we break ground on the season, right? We have to be able to thank Mother Earth after the harvest is done for the gifts that it's offered. So the ceremonial process is as important to our work. Um, and I mean, it's like you said, we're trying to restore a way of life. My colleagues have said before, like, we have these identities from where we come from, but it doesn't mean we can't live that identity anywhere in the world.
Mm.
We can be who we are because it's one home that we're essentially sharing here, which is
Yeah.
Mother Earth, and we can be ourselves wherever we may be as long as we carry that spirit and that knowledge with us.
Well, and you have a youth program as well, right? That Capaces runs.
Yeah, and that's important for the present and for the future for us. The Latino indigenous community here in Oregon is very young, like in our 20s.
Hmm.
And if you want to look to the future, you look to the youth, right? And you look at our school districts. And with that in mind, we created a leadership program. It was actually our first program, 13 plus years ago, to expose young folks to their cultural identities, to teach them about their leadership abilities and to activate them in community to do service projects. And so we've been running that program now for 13 plus years, and we have a summer academy where we employed a half dozen of them, and they're active in community and just at service of community. So that program's been very successful, and there's just a big need. Like we
Yeah.
serve the Woodburn community, but there's need to have youth development activities across the state, right?
Yeah. I think we're seeing that a lot, and especially as we talk about young people's mental health and the need to be connected to culturally responsive activities and things that help again people feel grounded, right? Getting connected, and especially for young people in a time, and I don't know, maybe I'll be soapboxy a little bit with social media and so many different influences that come in. It's like trying to find the way to just figure out who you are as you're growing up is so can be so challenging. So to have programs that offer that opportunity to be reconnected to culture, to language, where you can get grounded in a sense of space that doesn't feel like you're being pulled in 12 different directions, or you have to get likes or whatever it looks like on the new Snap, Twitter, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, the internet world has really pulled a lot of our youth, and they're very savvy in that world. The ones that have connection to that world. But we're human beings that have other needs.
Yeah.
Needs to connect with one another, needs to connect with nature, and we're trying to restore some balance there as much as we can,
Hmm.
and not just with our young folks. With our community in general, because there's a lot of silos.
Yeah.
We see that, whether that's in a home, honestly, or whether that's in a small community, like,
Hmm.
and we're trying to build communities. I think wherever we go, whether that's with Anawat, right, whether that's what Turno or the First Steps Early Childhood
Hmm.
Education program is. I think there's a lot of need for that, honestly,
Yeah.
especially these days.
Well, talk more about that. We talk about silos all the time, but typically when I'm talking about in the funder world, right? Of like foundations saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, we only fund, heritage programs, or we only fund youth programs," or and how we need to get through that sort of mode to get to that intersection of who people are. People aren't one-dimensional beings, and you talk about that a little
Mhm.
bit.
Well, I am part of the funder world too, Aaron. I think I mentioned this that, I'm in the Collins Foundation. I'm a trustee there, so I'm able to kind of view things from that perspective, right? And
Yeah.
there's a need for institutions, to organize things and to
Mm,
create structure, and which is important, and no doubt about it. But in doing so, I think we do create silos or reinforce silos,
yeah.
and we have to understand that humans have holistic needs.
Yeah. I think we get really sucked into these spaces of like, oh my gosh, this crisis is so large. I have to make sure. And especially, we see that with our nonprofit partners on the foundation side that we work with all the time of, I just have to keep food on the table for the
Yeah,
young people that we work with. I just have to make sure the bathrooms work. I just have to make sure the houseless camp has services. Or, we're so focused on the next crisis that it's so hard to think of the bigger picture and where we fit in the big picture.
yeah.
And so taking that moment, just put your hands in the dirt. It's a big deal.
It goes a long ways, and we've been able to do that. With our programming, we also have what we call tequios, which is sort of community services, a term from Oaxaca, where we invite folks from different parts of the state, and to come volunteer
Hmm.
and help us, as we start to plant the seeds, as we start to harvest the produce. There's a lot of stuff to do in a 6 acre farm, right? Like, and we have a small team there, so
Yeah.
we draw hundreds of folks, from young folks, to folks that work in government, to folks that work in business, higher ed, to come and put their hands in the dirt. I mean, it's like it's a big deal, if you
Yeah.
don't spend a lot of your time in those kinds of natural spaces. It
Hmm.
makes a real difference.
Yeah, and you get to connect with others in the some around something similar, right? I think that's the other piece that we miss a little bit, and maybe it's social media, maybe it's the way that we work anymore, is that finding that sense of community and having other people to rely on. Which, I mean, frankly, is part of the reason that I started this podcast. Was like, who else is doing this rural work? Why does it feel like I'm up here swimming upstream a little bit? How do we find community and how do we rely on each other? And we don't have the neighborhood pubs like we used to, or
Mhm.
the civic engagement groups that we're seeing. I think you're filling that role. Your organization is filling that role.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from trying to be as kind of as fluid as possible and just move with the energy that's around you, right? But I think there's a lot of need in community for bridge building, and people that do that work, whether they're folks that are in church, or folks that are in schools, or folks that are in small business, and working in government. Like, who are those folks that are willing to move across sectors, across populations, to work with people, and help build their ideas, right? So we can create stronger and safer communities for one another. So
we so often we see relationships as like what as a transaction anymore. What do I get? What am I going to do? And especially on the fundee side, right? Of like, how am I just going to get what I need to move forward, or how am I going to get them to fulfill it on the funding side? And you probably see this with your term on the board as well, of like, how do I get that organization to fulfill the mission of the foundation, right? So how do I
Mhm.
fund them to say that I am a climate funder or I am a whatever? And it becomes very transactional. So how do we get beyond that? I mean, what works for you when you build relationships?
I go out and about. And, I'm a child at heart. Like I love to observe the masses. I, I think you just have to approach the world with a lot of curiosity, right? And curiosity brings sort of like endless possibilities and questions and a place of learning rather than a place of assumption. I'm a person that doesn't like to say no to things, uh, which can get me into some trouble, right? Like, because everything is could be an amazing idea, right? And some of my colleagues can kind of bug me for that because, like, well, we need to build the infrastructure first, right, before we start running with the projects. But I think you need a good balance, right, of both.
Yeah.
You need your builders and you need your dreamers and whatnot to make things
Yeah.
happen.
No, I love that. Oh my gosh. Well, and that learning versus an assumption, that's something that we deal with a lot on the philanthropic side of like, I have this brilliant idea and you all need to go and do the work. And we see that especially from folks coming into spaces that are further away from power,
Yeah.
right? Well, we know how we could fix it. We could fix you, right? So I love that concept of learning.
I mean, I'll give you an example, right? There's this concept of best practices. You've probably heard of it.
I have.
And best practices for who? I believe in what one of my elders says, effective practices.
Mm,
Because what might be a best practice for some group might not be for another group, from one community to another.
yeah.
And so I think we have to kind of dump out
Yeah.
sometimes what we know, right? And let the child kind of be curious and build it with what around them.
Yeah.
Uh,
So in 10 years, what are you dreaming about that your organization looks like?
I have no idea. um, it really depends, right? I think
Yeah.
you have to observe your surroundings, your context, and see where the energy's at.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier we had this food truck, and we accepted it with like no idea what we're gonna do with this thing, and it's sitting on a lot that we have in Woodburn that we bought like, gosh, almost 10 years that we haven't done nothing with.
Mm,
But we know the answer is in community.
yeah.
You start talking with folks, right, and bringing people together, and before you know, you have a building, or you have a food truck going around town
Yeah.
selling milpa
Mm,
or making products out of milpa. So that's where I'm at, and we get pushed to do strategic planning and like visioning work and all of that, and I think that's important to have goals and things like that. But I think we have to observe our surroundings and look for the signs and then go from there.
yeah. And I think that's a really important thing that funders need to hear too, is like sometimes community changes, even though, we have a plan or you have a vision of where you think you're going to go. The community asks for different things, or there are ways that you get pulled in different directions. And that could be just the nature of the way things happen, or the fact that you have a natural disaster, or you have some other, we have a pandemic or something else that pulls us in different ways. And so being responsive to community and responsive to organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I would sum it up is like everyone has a gift, and what was Picasso said, right? Like the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose is to give it away.
Mm,
And you have to look for that in people, and everyone has a gift,
yeah.
and let's give it away. I would say that's probably, if I have to sum up a vision, that's it right there.
That's very philosophical. It's very philosophical. Oh my goodness. Thank you again. It's always such a gift to speak with you and chat and hear about all the wonderful things you're working on at home, personally, with all of your work, with your volunteer time. I just don't know how you have any time for anything. You do too much.
Well, we're only here for a little bit, so might as well stay busy. Thank you so much, Aaron. Appreciate it.
love Jaime's spontaneity and energy and just how he is responsive to community. And I know when we asked that question about where do you see yourself in 10 years, and he's like, I don't know. I sometimes I wish that philanthropy could live in that space a little bit of, yeah, we have these strategies and we have these goals and we have these visions, but as things shift and communities shift, maybe our strategy needs to shift, or maybe we need to figure out how to be responsive in that space to do both and really listen to community. And I love that everyone has a gift, and how can we best support and honor those gifts that our communities bring to us. Thanks for listening to Funding Rural. Check out fundingrural.com for transcripts and all sorts of additional information.